Hello, my name is Sue Koenig, and I serve as the quarter-time Director of Racial Justice and Healing for the Moravian Church Northern Province. And we, as the Northern Province Racial Justice Team, organized a pilgrimage to Montgomery, Alabama, which after delays because of COVID, we finally were able to begin and to take our journey, the beginning part of our journey to Montgomery in September of this year, from September 13th through the 16th. We went to Montgomery, to this place that is a holy land for the United States, and we went there to do a number of things, including to have the guidance of two spiritual guides, the Rev Dr. Frank Crouch and Dr. Catherine Meeks, who were with us. Dr. Catherine Meeks is the director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing in Atlanta, Georgia, and Rev Dr. Frank Crouch, the retired dean and professor of New Testament from Moravian Theological Seminary, who has been researching a history of slavery in the Moravian Church. 74 of the Moravian clergy and licensed ministers and candidates for ordination, a total of 74 people went on the pilgrimage, and we had those accompanying us from the Southern Province as well as from Lancaster Seminary. And as we went to Montgomery, and we spent time learning on racial justice issues, and then visited the Equal Justice Initiative Memorial, the Peace and Justice Memorial, and the Equal Justice Legacy Museum. And while we were there, the purpose really was to open our hearts and our minds to become aware of the legacy of slavery and its continuing impact on all of our lives, to open our hearts and minds and to set the church in Northern Province on a path towards racial justice and healing, to begin to heal the wounds that have been caused by racism, and to set a new path with justice and healing. This afternoon we have the opportunity to be together and to have some reflections from those that attended the pilgrimage, and I look forward to hearing your reflections and on your experiences.
I'm still reflecting. It was such a, I think, a pivotal moment in the Moravian Church, of which I've always been a part, but coming from a Caribbean background, there is a different element to it, and there was an element of curiosity to find out exactly what are we going to do, what are we going to say. But I recall at the very beginning of the statement by our PC president that gave me the impression that, okay, we are taking on this in a real way. And from that moment, you know, I was engaged in a way that continues. You know, it's as if I'm still there, because when I got up here on Monday, I did the long loop, here being the Claggett Center in Maryland, and they have actually a slave grave site. And normally I would just start to take pictures, but I didn't see a picture opportunity. I saw a memory. I heard a song, and I'll share that. Maybe they would not have sung that hymn, but I heard in my head, for all the saints who from their labor rest. And all the saints and labor took on a whole different meaning. But that's just one element of what the experience has done to me.
I think, Sue, in your introduction, you talked about opening our hearts and our minds. And I think for me, and this was my second time in Montgomery. I was able to go in January of 2020 when the PEC and my colleague bishops were asked to take a pilgrimage. And for me, I had my eyes opened. And I came away from that first experience saying that I was embarrassed and ashamed by how uninformed I've been about the issues of racism in our country. And so the opportunity to go back to Montgomery, to visit the places a second time, to dig a little deeper, and in addition to having done a lot of reading in the last 2 years, it was a very powerful experience, again, to visit the museum and the memorial and the places we visited and to hear Dr. Meeks.
Prior to my visit to Montgomery, I recalled one of my members saying to me, Rev, it's going to be very, very intense because our past pastor had visited the site before. And so I wasn't sure what to expect because intense it's wide, it's varied, right? And so coming also from the Caribbean, we know that a part of our history, we've always been taught slavery in school and the impact that it has had on us as a people. And I must say, with all honesty, when I walked into the Legacy Museum that morning, it's as if a scar, the covering on a scar was ripped off, and I became angry the very moment I walked in, as I began to see all those images of those who would have been my brothers and my sisters, and to see the images being chained in such a cruel way. I was angry. And I continue to reflect on that experience because it will live with me for the rest of my life. It's brought a whole new meaning to all that I've been taught right throughout my childhood about slavery and racism.
I think for me in the museum, when I entered the museum, and it was where the images of the heads with chains around their neck of the 12 million Africans kidnapped and brought to North America, 2 million never even made it off the ship. They died on the way. And this image with the water coming over, and just how powerful that was. And I thought to myself, maybe they were the lucky ones. And that's sad. But it was so powerful, so powerful.
Yeah, so I felt the same way. I had been to the previous Legacy Museum that had been in another location. It was much smaller, and walking into the entrance and then seeing that representation there with all of the people of every age, the infants with their mothers, and the little children and teens and older people, seeing all of them, and I tried to be very intentional about looking at every face, and just it was just overwhelming in terms of grief and regret for what was lost, their lives lost.
I have to kind of explain where I come from in order to explain my reactions to the experience. I mean, I grew up in the South. I was in elementary school when they began integrating our school system. I was in the 6th grade when the African American school system and the white school system completely integrated. I heard from my family everything on the spectrum from pretty racist to we're all made in the image of God. I could see kind of the progression of generations of people coming to terms with racism and trying not to be, but still being caught in this Southern culture of even if our schools integrated and businesses were open to African Americans and white people, that there was still this bifurcation of our lives together, and yet we were so intertwined in so many ways. I just, growing up, saw a lot of hope in the changes. Like when I was a small child, I saw going into the barbecue restaurant, the whites only sign, and questioning that. I saw the hope of that changing. I mean, I still go home today and I go into that restaurant with my family and I feel so happy that there are all kinds of people there. And yet, after all the effort to integrate our school system, in my hometown now, because of white flight, we essentially have an African American city schools and outside the city, more mixed, more white school system. And I think, so much effort went into that. So, when I think about racism in my life, it's so much a both and, So I went to Montgomery really wondering what my emotional reactions would be to something that I experienced just from my place in the world. And I have to echo you, Doug, walking through the Legacy Museum and seeing all the images, you talking about the people, the heads, I knew that, but I had not, as a white person living in America that has an incredible amount of amnesia about our racism, had not factored in the evolution of slavery, which they laid out so well for us. The transatlantic slave trade, and then the domestic slave trade, and then the lynchings, and then Jim Crow, and then incarceration. I mean, every step of the way, those of us in America who've had power have managed to find new ways to enslave and oppress. And that was probably what I took away the most, that slavery isn't over. I mean, I've always known that we're not over with racism, but that it's just called by different names. So I felt, a lot of sadness and a lot of regret that I grew up in North Carolina, and even though I saw the KKK signs going back and forth between my home and my grandparents, I never knew so much of that history. We just omitted telling ourselves that history, the history of lynching. We omitted admitting how much incarceration is a part of slavery. So it was really good to be able to do that with people that I know and love and trust. It was good to be able to do that together.
I think for me too, there was and you've mentioned it, there was the transatlantic slavery. And then after that was outlawed, well, then it was domestic. And the number of slaves that came to the northern states, to New Jersey, New York, and reading that in New Jersey, if you purchased a slave, you were given 75 acres of land.
Wow.
Yeah. It was all financially incentive to own slaves. And I shared with the group in Montgomery, and I'll share it on this video. In doing a family history a couple of years ago, my daughter went back into our ancestry, and I think it was my mother's great-great-grandfather, who was a man in New Jersey. And when he passed away, the estate contents of his estate was listed. And I remember my mother had told us that she was mostly Welsh, but that she had some French and Dutch in her background somewhere, but she didn't know anything about it. And the contents started out with a Dutch Bible, but then it went to a Negro by the name of Flora. And then it listed several other Negroes that were possessions. And when I read that and realized that my family owned slaves, I was embarrassed and ashamed. it's something that I feel badly about. I can't change it. And I remember when I first read it, I thought, well, maybe they were domestic help, or maybe they were servants. And then I realized, no, when you own someone as a possession, the only word to describe it is slave. And at the pilgrimage, after I shared that with the group, I had 2 or 3 other clergy people from our denomination come up to me and say, my family too. And
Pretty sure that's the case.
yeah, and I thought back that great-great-grandparents, there's 16 of those we all have, and how much do we really know about our families? And, to Michael, to Evette, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I can see why you're angry. You should be.
Going back, go ahead, Michael. Thank you. You mentioned lynching. Prior to my visit to the museum, I thought that lynching was, they just hang them and they would die quickly. But then when I walked and I saw them going higher and higher and higher and higher and yet higher, then I realized how cruel a death.
Yeah.
They died. They were tortured.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't just the hanging, it was what went before. Yeah.
And the reasons behind some of these things. You were lynched because you looked at a white woman from behind. You were lynched because you refused to give up your space. You were lynched for absolutely no reason. And how do you justify that?
And then to know too that it was entertainment also. And that for me, that level of human depravity is difficult for me to understand. Because in my mind, lynching, any sort of killing, I even to kill to shoot a bird for me, it's something that doesn't go well. And just the thought that people would be entertained. It was advertised just like a show when persons turned up. So what I realize is that, and I think all races probably need to have a trip like that, because even some folks who live through some of the period or close to it, that when they see it all in one place and can appreciate the impact, it's going to be different. And that's why I'm glad that we actually were stationed in Montgomery. But one good thing that came out of it, I believe Dr. King's, I Have a Dream speech is one of the better speeches. And it was amazing because one of the things he did say down there in Alabama with its vicious racists, its governor having his lips dripping with the words of imposition and nullification. Right down there in Alabama, they will come, little black boys and little black girls will sit down together at the table of brotherhood. And just to see that, well, we're not so little anymore, but we were sitting down together. But that Alabama, with all this vicious racism in the past, and I'm sure there are elements of it, but in a sense, it has become this holy land from which we are trying to move forward. And that was redemptive to me. I found some healing in it, and I think that we all, because I left from there thinking, okay, I need to take my young people here, because many of them are not engaged in the whole, the voting system, and they need to understand what's at stake and what was sacrificed. And so what we might do as the follow-up may vary from one place to another. And that for me.
I want to share a story of how I was impacted this time with a situation where something happened prior to going to Montgomery, which is back at the end of May. And I read a story in the New York Times about two sisters. And their names are Minnie and Mary. And they live together today in Montgomery, Alabama. And I read their story. It was a heartbreaking story of how they were wounded for their entire lives through the practice of eugenics and were sterilized as young girls. And they're living there in Montgomery. They have only one another now that they cling to. And their hearts have been completely broken because they have never been able to have children. And the youngest one has her sister and a baby doll that she keeps with her. It was heart-wrenching. And when I got to Montgomery, which I've been there 3 times actually, and was walking through the Peace and Justice Memorial, I came upon one of the monuments that was for a county in Georgia. And I believe because I had Minnie and Mary with me, carrying them, knowing they were right there in the city, I noticed that there were the names of two women on this this monument, and their names were Emma and Lily. And I thought, I imagined this as 2 sisters. So I took a photograph of this, and then I continued through the Peace and Justice Memorial. And when I came down to where they have the plaques that give information about the lynchings, I saw that I think it was Calvin Mike had voted in this Georgia County's election, and a white mob in response lynched his elderly mother and his 2 young daughters, Emma and Lily. And for me, this comes together that we have people who are so wounded as a result of all of these horrendous acts of racism, and people whose lives were lost as a result of it. And it makes me angry, and it also gives me deep grief, and it also compels me to look to see, how is this still happening today? And if we have a situation where voting rights, I mean, these little girls were lynched, these little children lynched because their father voted in an election. And what we see happening today with the election, with the voting rights, it is something that requires our outcry on this as a church. And I also thought, just in these past days, reflecting on the experience in Montgomery, and seeing people arrested in Florida, and recognizing that for what it is a mechanism for inducing fear to prevent people from voting. And so it is critical for the church to inform people, and to take people, and to take young people to experience this, and to know what's at stake. We must know the history, and we also must see what's happening in the present and respond to that.
I think Catherine Meeks talked about that this is an ongoing process, that this is a lifetime work and will be. And I think that's something that we need to be taking steps always moving forward. And
For me, the other profound thing she said was that racism has wounded all of us, and being able to name how this wounding has happened and continues to happen, and to intervene to stop that, first within the church and then within the communities in which we live.
And I also believe that she mentioned that it was the church that orchestrated a change, and the church needs to continue in this path.
You know, I was amazed when we went to visit Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. I had always, you know, this is Martin Luther King Jr.'s church. I had always imagined this like big grand church, and it was little, you know, it was like a little Moravian church with these like pretty beautiful stained glass windows that had colors, but not like Tiffany windows. It was just like this little church. And, you know, when we went to the Rosa Parks Museum, and where they had the big rallies and stuff was at Holt Street Baptist Church, which was Abernathy's church. I'm thinking, you know, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church did the work of releasing their pastor, to give him the time and the freedom to do the work that he did. And that's such a gift that churches can give, to release their leaders, not just the pastors, but everybody, so that we're not so tied up with we got to take care of the institution that we can't take care of the kingdom of God and the work of the kingdom. So I'm like, you go, little church.
And I think you've made a great point there regarding the church releasing the leader to do that which he or she has been called to do. And that can only happen when the church has caught the vision. But if the church has not caught the vision, then they won't be in a place to release the leader to do what needs to be done.
And they have to have the courage and recognize that this is difficult work. I won't say maybe, it is difficult work, and have to be persistent and persevere. And the pilgrimage came out of legislation from the Northern Province Synod of 2018, requiring anti-racism training for the clergy, but also calling on all congregations to support their pastors in this work, and also for every member to make the work of racial justice and healing part of what they do as Christians.
I think the visit to the Rosa Parks Museum reinforced what we had been thinking about before from other presentations before at other synods. The point was, Rosa Parks didn't just suddenly out of nowhere decide not to give up her seat, that all these people had been working for years to build the kind of networking and sense of support and commitment together in Montgomery and beyond, that flashpoint would not have happened and been successful if the work had not been done previously. And, you know, King just managed to be there at the right time, at the right moment, and the Holy Spirit did its work. But, you know, that kind of gave me and continues to give me hope that even though we don't see big incremental changes, that just like they did all this work for decades and years leading up to it, that the work we do may lay the foundation for the critical change moments that may happen in the future. Yeah.
And especially with Rosa, what I'm reminded of is that it may not the biggest thing. She was working in the background, but being, you know, offended by the situation and getting angry about it is not enough. At some point, you got to do something, and you know, you can understand the fear that some persons have regarding the possible repercussions that may have. But she did something. It was sort of painful. Okay, but why didn't some others step in as well? But you can't, you realize you just have to do what needs to be done. You have to be willing to make the sacrifice. And the pilgrimage also gave me a remarkable, appreciation. I've always appreciated the place that Rev Dr. King played. But one coming to that little church, but just that, because I think most persons maybe not even aware that this guy was just 38 or 37 when he died. But he was committed when he made his last speech. I've been to the mountaintop, I've looked over, I've seen the promised land. I mean, get there with you, but other people will get there together. Then you realize he had invested his life. He was so fully into that. And I'm thinking, what can I do that perpetuate the appreciation for the sacrifice that he had? And that is in the back of my head. And that's one of the reasons I said, at least one thing I can do, really get young people to appreciate the importance of and the sacrifice that was made that we can vote. And when you don't go out and vote, what can happen as a result? So there's that consciousness. But there was also for me that we realized that racism is one element of injustice, and that there are many other areas in which injustice is perpetuated, even within the walls of the church. And how might we also address those?
And I want to think that, like Rosa Parks, who broke her silence that morning or afternoon, whenever it was, the church needs to break her silence.
And sorry to be butting, but it makes me too appreciative of you, Brother Doug, that you're honest enough and feel, because I can sense your pain when you speak. But I think it is what we need to be at that place where we acknowledge, and where it's deemed necessarily, apologize and move on. And that this takeaway, when I also thought about Frank's presentation, and you can see, it wasn't just a presentation for him. It's an emotional outpouring. And that level of sincerity is suggesting that it's a very genuine effort that has been made to address the matter.
Yes.
And that for me was a positive that I took out of there.
Yes, his compassion was evident.
Right.
Yes.
And now we have to keep taking more steps.
Yes.
Right.
And they'll be different for each congregation, I'm sure.
Right.
And I'm hoping our pastors, as they've gone back, are beginning to explore with their congregations, how can we educate, how can we inform, how can we better understand what has happened in order to move forward in a better way.
But I'm gonna touch on a point here where I'm not even sure I should, but I'm gonna go there.
Go right ahead.
How many of our pastors really believe that there is an issue with racism?
I guess
and
that
congregations, they think this was part of this, and holding together the fact that this is a lifetime journey, because this is something that will be continuing on, but at the same time holding that together with the urgency of now, that we cannot wait to act. We have to begin to act now, even in the midst of not having everyone on board. We have to begin that movement forward, and then others will come.
I think back, again, my experience. I remember my parents would not have been the kind of people to join a demonstration. They would not have been the kind of people to actively try to change a rule or something like that. But when it came to integration, they totally supported public school education, and they kept us in public school. So there was this there are people who are willing to quietly move forward even though they're not going to be at the forefront. And I think we really need to try to find ways to help those of us who can look back and say, oh, weren't those people in the civil rights movement great? To look now in the present and say, how can we move forward, help everybody, the people who need to, who want to move quietly forward, as much as we cheer on the people who are out there in the forefront who pull us all forward, because you need everybody. And yet, we're not, like you said, we're not ever going to have everybody on board. If we wait for that, it will never, ever happen. So whenever we can draw support from one another, it really is important.
You know, I think this is it's a good first. We have to start somewhere. And as I said, everybody's not going to be on board, and going there changed things for me. It's one ring. It was difficult reading it. You know, we were taught in history, particularly much of this. But when you get there, you see it in a whole different way, and it's as close to it as we'll get. And if more persons can get there and see that, I think it has there is a possibility, and including those who might even embrace racism, that if they were able to, if they see it all in one place, in a sense, that it might just cause them to change a little bit. But I believe what I saw from the church was genuine, and what I don't believe that everybody will be on board, and we can't wait for everybody to be on board. But if we, in our own congregations, whatever it is that we can do, but we must do something, and it can't be just a trip that we went on. It must be a journey on which we have embarked, and we share with our people the impact it has on us, and what is it that we can do.
I wanted to say something that I really appreciated about the museum. I thought the museum did a really good job of presenting the experience from the perspective of the people who were in it, from the perspective of the people in the slave boats, and from the perspective of the people in the domestic slave trade that were separated from their families, and the perspective of the prisoners and incarcerated. That it was from that perspective that helped you really empathize, rather than from the focus being on the oppressor. There was definitely, the wall that had all the quotes from the white supremacists, but it wasn't like they were writ large. It was the experience of the people that was writ large, and it really invited you to empathize in a way that maybe we wouldn't have empathized if we had seen, say, the comparison of the kids who were demonstrating and the water hoses were turned on them. I've seen so many pictures of them and the troopers that are turning the water on them, and in the museum it was the picture of just them without the oppressor. And maybe those of us who've been part of the oppressing class need to see the oppressors, but the invitation to feel empathy for the experience and to feel the power of the people who endured and resisted, I think was one of the greatest strengths of the museum, that you had to look people in the face, talk to the prisoner, see the kids in the cell asking for where their parents were. It was really very, very well done.
The pilgrimage was transformational. You can't go on a pilgrimage like that and come back the same. It changes you forever.
And I said that just as something that I'll forever be grateful that we took it on, and at the church, and in earnestness. And as we go forward, I feel that something has started that we do have that responsibility to see through. And even through this conversation today is an indication that it's not a mere trip. Right. And I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm also grateful for the opportunity to have attended. As I mentioned earlier, that it has really impacted me. And my desire is that as a church, as Michael just said, it won't stop here. And we must come to the realization that it is more than having a conversation, but this should inspire us to move to action, or greater action, because we are already acting, but we need to move to greater action for the transformation.